Hey everyone, and welcome to Seriously Risky Business, the podcast we do here at Risky Biz HQ with Tom Uren, who is our policy and intelligence editor. Basically, what happens is this: Tom writes a big newsletter once a week called Seriously Risky Business, which goes out to all of the email subscribers, and you can subscribe to it too by going to risky.biz. And then Tom and I have a chat about it, so that there's a podcast version of the newsletter. Although these days Amberly Jack is hosting this podcast most of the time, I'm filling in because Amberly is on medical leave recovering. Get well soon, Amberly. Today's edition of Seriously Risky Business is brought to you by Push Security, which is a fantastic company that does browser-based security. So they got essentially a browser extension that just sits there and looks for bad stuff happening. And it's a really great way to catch phishing that that your email security solution might miss, like, a dodgy URL via LinkedIn or whatever. It catches a lot of stuff. It's very, very cool. That's Push Security, this week's sponsor. But Tom, we've just finished going over your newsletter for the week, and we've got three things we're going to talk about today. One of them is this really dumb Russian state-sponsored hacktivism, which is just we spoke about that in the weekly show as well. It's just crazy. The other thing we are talking about is this wiper/ransomware attack against Venezuela's state-owned oil company, which you and I both agree probably could maybe be America, which is a bit wild. But before we get into them, because we did talk about them in the weekly show, I wanted to talk about this other piece you've written here, which is about a series of reports that have come out in the last month, all honing in on this topic, which is everyone's reliance on Chinese manufacturers when it comes to the renewable energy transition. So whether we're talking about solar inverters or grid-connected batteries or whatever, all of this stuff is coming from China. And, this is a country that in its spare time tasks its academics and military people with writing peer-reviewed academic papers about how one might best attack America's electricity grid. Seems like maybe not the best place to get your grid equipment from.
Yeah. So this really strikes me like the Huawei debate back in the day, where people were concerned about having Huawei and ZTE telecommunications equipment in their 5G networks. But it seems like it's actually a whole lot worse. And so the big picture, stepping back, is that China's massively investing in electrification of its energy grid, or its energy supply systems, like replacing oil, replacing coal to some degree. And the country's so large that it's just rolling out a huge amount of equipment, and it's building it at very competitive prices. And it's essentially become a sort of dominant player in many parts of, many factors of what you need for an electricity grid. And this has all been happening and Western countries are now somewhat dependent for many of those things. It's not just batteries, it's not just inverters, but other parts of the electrical grid. And the Huawei debate always felt somewhat theoretical. There was no actual evidence of bad things like sabotage being actually considered. This was, maybe a decade ago. But nowadays, we've got Volt Typhoon, which is that Chinese group that is going around pre-positioning in critical infrastructure, apparently for the purpose of sabotage. So you have a very clear intent, coupled with the dependence. It's not like you've got several other, for some of these types of equipment, it's not like you've got several other competitive firms. China is the dominant player. And so it seems like we're in much worse of a pickle than we were back in the day. And the other thing that strikes me is that these types of equipment are, there's actually an example of a Chinese manufacturer flicking the switch and turning off their inverters. Now, this was a commercial dispute.
It's a commercial dispute. That's what makes it so funny, is somebody violated their reseller agreement or something. So they just flipped the switch on all of these devices that were sold outside of the terms of their commercial contract. And, that's all well and good. And I guess they're within their rights to do that because the end user license agreement says so. But it is the sort of thing to make a Western think tanker go,
Yeah. So this was I really struggle to think that a Western manufacturer would do that. So it kind of displays a different mindset, a very like quite brutal mindset, frankly. Of
well, now they're beating us at capitalism, which is quite the achievement considering their history.
So I went into reading these different reports. As I do with a fair bit of skepticism, I think it's quite easy to take a China bad perspective, and there's definitely people who take that regardless of what the facts are. But the more I read, the more concerned I got, and it's kind of a topic that is, well, it's snuck up on me until now. Like, I knew there was a lot of Chinese solar-based inverters, but I didn't realize how much of the entire grid was dependent. And another part of the problem is that a lot of these systems are they fall below thresholds where cybersecurity standards have to be very strict. Maybe very strict is too strong a word, but and so there's a lot of them that can sneak under the under the bar without a whole lot of oversight or review or whatever. And so any one system is not that important, but when you've got tons and tons of them, it becomes quite significant.
We've seen various research papers as well from people saying, you could use these vulnerabilities in various inverters and whatnot to trigger cascading failures on the grid and whatnot. I mean, it does. This is the problem when you're trying to look at a topic like this, is it just does sound a little bit hysterical and unrealistic. There's some great stuff in here too, which is this, strategic intelligence firm Strider, who wrote one of these reports, looked at Chinese research publications, and I alluded to this in the intro, and they found there were 225 papers written by PLA-affiliated organizations that were basically like dreaming up scenarios for how to attack the grid in America. And this is like where America's buying its grid tech from. So, it feels like it's a real challenge. That said, you've also talked about a report from, I think it was Dragos and another company, looking about like what you can do to sort of mitigate some of the harms here. And that's where I feel like there might be some hope here, Tom, is unlike Huawei, which is, was making equipment that would form the core and the edge of a 5G network, because that's kind of how 5G networks work. These things, at least from a sort of internet comms perspective, are a little bit simpler, and you might be able to architect your way out of this. Was that the vibe from the Dragos report?
Yeah, I thought that it's a very tricky problem when you're relying on an adversary for equipment. But I think you're right that the whole purpose of 5G equipment is to talk to other stuff. And so it's quite hard to say, well, you cannot talk to this. Like, how do you firewall a network? Like, that's the whole point, is to talk to other stuff. And the electricity equipment is like what it's trying to do is more defined. So at least in theory, there's some hope there that you can do a more convincing job locking it down. Not maybe a perfect job, but I think that the compensating controls are more robust, perhaps, is a way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some idiotic politics seep into this issue in the past as well. As an Australian politician, I won't name him, but I think the joke about him is he seems like he was bioengineered in an IPA laboratory, right? The IPA is a conservative think tank here in Australia. I'll name him. It's James Patterson, Senator James Patterson, who is, I think, what is he, like shadow? Probably got a few portfolios given the lack of members his party has at the moment, but he put out a release a couple of years ago saying that the government was putting Australian national security at risk because it was allowing vulnerable Chinese solar tech to be installed into Australian households. Now, look, I mean, is the security of Chinese tech being installed into Australian households something worthy of scrutiny? Absolutely, but when you are using this as a way to just smear renewables, it's like no one engages with it, right? So I feel like this is one of those rare cases in cybersecurity where, outside politics are kind of bleeding into it a bit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think the overall dynamic is that there's a large anti-China lobby, which has a lot of justification. And there's
there's a large anti-renewable lobby.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a problem where like it actually has significant benefits, these technologies, from both a cost and a carbon perspective, but they're difficult because they cause a lot of change, and change is bad. So the looking at the security aspects in isolation is like not the right answer. Like, we need to have there's a risk here, but we also need to manage that given the other benefits that we get out of these technologies. And that's actually quite hard, I think, because security people tend to focus on just security. And it's quite hard to get people to weigh up the risks and benefits when they're in two different areas.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, look, let's move on to, and look, I guess we're sticking with energy as a theme this week. Venezuela's state-run oil company, PDVSA, it experienced either a wiper or a ransomware attack, which has apparently really devastated its operations. And this comes hot on the heels of the Americans seizing a tanker full of oil that had left Venezuela. And PDVSA has blamed those imperialist Americans for doing this. And in normal times, Tom, you would hear the Venezuelans say this and you'd say, sure, buddy, the Americans did it, because they like to say the Americans did everything. Of course, the Americans are their most useful foreign enemy for domestic political purposes. So normally you hear something like this and you just think it's a lie. In this case, your reaction, my reaction, Adam Boileau's reaction has been very well could have been the Americans who were behind this. And, you've spelled it out here in a short piece saying, well, yes, it could be a US Cyber Command or CIA operation.
Yeah, so I've written a couple of times about particularly President Trump's desire to do something about Venezuela. And the history is that throughout his entire first term, maybe not the entire first term, but for much of his first term, there were cyber operations that were carried out in more or less isolation because there was a whole lot of pushback from, the bureaucracy or the deep state, I guess, that didn't want to do these kind of, I'll call them outrageous operations, which involve conventional force. And he was basically restrained by what I would describe as wiser heads. And so the cyber operations were in a way a kind of, look, we'll do this. And people carrying them out probably knew that they weren't going to work in isolation. And so one of the examples was they disrupted the payroll for military officers in the Venezuelan army. And they kicked around other ideas. So there have been people thinking about what to do against Venezuela for a long time. One of the operations was to, I think, disable super tankers or something like that. These ideas have been kicking around. And what stopped them back then was people like the head of the CIA, I think it was Gina Haspel, who just didn't like the idea of these kind of destructive operations.
Well, and a lot of the stuff that the CIA wound up doing, they kind of half-assed it as well. Like we sort of found out years later, which was kind of funny, which is they kind of said, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And then did a really bad job of it, basically, because they didn't really take it seriously or dedicate resources to it. But this time it really feels different, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I think what's changed is that all the senior personnel are now on board with these kinds of operations. So I would be, in a way, at this point, I'd be surprised if it wasn't a US operation. There's no guarantees, but it kind of aligns with what they're trying to do. It's happening at the same time. They've kicked around a whole lot of operations before and didn't do them because they were restrained by senior personnel. Those senior personnel are gone. And so, what would stop them? I don't think there is anything that would stop them.
No, one thing that occurred to me as well is that, if you're Venezuela and the Americans are doing this to you, there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. Because even if you did have a capability, and they're not particularly known for their cyber prowess, even if they did have a capability to be able to hit back, Trump is itching for an excuse to start dropping warheads on foreheads, right? And, if Venezuela were to escalate this, even in the cyber domain, it would be disastrous for them. So they just have to sit there and take it, which is another data point that makes me think, or another bit of speculation that makes me think it's the Americans, because why not? They're holding all the cards in this case.
Yeah, I think the only kind of operations that make sense are ones that have, no impact, like hack and leak. Like, you could do a hack and leak and Trump wouldn't necessarily escalate. But at this point, there's nothing that you could hack and leak about President Trump that would have any impact on his popularity or anything.
Well, so, as he once said, he could shoot someone in the middle of Times Square and it wouldn't matter, and that turned out to be pretty prescient, really. But, I guess one thing that's interesting about this is it's been about 13 years since, we saw the Biggie versus Tupac style wiper wars in the Middle East with Iranian oil infrastructure being targeted first with wipers, and then Saudi Aramco having 30,000 of its workstations vaped for a while. So now we got like maybe America is doing a shamoon, I guess is where we've left that, and not something I would have expected to say until recently. And just finally and quickly, because this is something that we covered in the weekly show with Adam, you've also taken a look at these state-backed hacktivists, the Russians, who really just haven't achieved anything, are pretty dumb. But, you've also argued they're sort of dumb until they're not, and that makes them possibly dangerous, which I think is a good point. But it seems an odd way to run a country, which is to throw money at people like this and tell them to just go and cause problems. For those who've missed it, the US has indicted some people for, basically being state-funded hacktivists who just went around attacking any control system that was vulnerable and trying to fiddle with dials and just make life tough. But it doesn't look like they really caused any damage.
Yeah, I think the thing that makes this kind of make sense from a Russian point of view is the invasion of Ukraine. And so at that point, I'm assuming that the intelligence services were under pressure to do something. And so this is something. And so to me, that is the sort of underlying motivation for these groups. And they just went, well, we've got a person, we can shovel some money to them, get them to do some things, and maybe that'll pay off. But it doesn't cost us all that much in terms of time and resources. Like, giving money to a group of people is, that's the thing we've got most of. It's the time and effort, and so, like, that kind of makes sense. I think if it weren't for the war, they wouldn't be doing this.
No, but it is very low effort and has potential to blow back on him as well. Like, it just doesn't seem like there's much of a benefit here. And, one thing that I've learned from following your work, Tom, is just how much of this activity is dictated by people's need to impress their bosses by putting stuff in a PowerPoint presentation and saying, look, we did a thing, whether that's the Iranians or the Russians or even the Chinese. Mate, that is actually it for our discussion this week in the Seriously Risky Business podcast, the last one for 2025, of course, when this podcast resumes next year. It'll be back to Amberly Jack hosting, but it was a lot of fun to fill in for her and have this chat with you, Tom. And thank you for all of the terrific work you've done through this year, mate. And looking forward to seeing you again in 26.
Thanks, Patrick.